Good morning. This is the House Appropriations Committee on Thursday, January 16th, 2025, with a continuation of budget adjustment testimony. And we have joining us now the Department of Vermont Health Access, also known as DEVA. And we have Deshawn Groves, who's the Commissioner. Welcome. And Stephanie Barrett, Chief Financial Officer. So welcome, both of you. We have a bunch of new members and we have a guest from the Healthcare Committee here. So we'll introduce ourselves and then you can introduce yourselves and tell us all about your budget adjustment. So Dave, we're going to start with you again.
Dave Iacoboni, the representative for Lamoille, Washington District, live in Morrisville.
Good morning and welcome. John Casesto from Essex Caledonia District, and I'm from the town of Burke.
Mike Nigro, representing Bennington and Powell. Tom Stevens from Waterbury, representing Washington Chittenden.
Jim Harrison, Chittenden, Mendon, Killington, and Pittsfield. Welcome.
Robin Scheid from Middlebury.
Tiff Wooley from Burlington.
Trevor Swirl, Underhill and Jericho.
Wayne Lynch from Highgate, Franklin, Berkshire, and Richmond.
Good morning, Mike Rowicki, and I represent the Wyndham 4 District.
Lynn Dickinson, I represent St. Albans Town.
And we have a member of the Healthcare Committee here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Page.
So that's us, and introduce yourselves for the record, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. I am Deshawn Groves, the Commissioner for the Department of Vermont Health Access.
And I'm Stephanie Barrett, the Financial Director for DEVA. So what is the committee's pleasure? Would you like to go through the narrative document and just switch to the ups and downs, or would you like to go line by line through the ups down sheet? Do you have a preference?
We have an hour. Dave, this one's yours, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we have new people who aren't familiar. We don't need to go too, we can keep it fairly high level, but and then I know there'll be questions. So we'll start with the narrative.
Okay,
Great, and go from there. Yeah. Thank you.
So the first section in our budget world is our administrative budget. And out of our total $1.25 billion budget, the administrative budget is just under $180 million. And so out of the administrative budget, we pay for all the staffing costs, contract costs, operating costs, and there are a small amount of grants, mostly related to Blueprint, that flow out of our administrative budget. And just to give you a little context, our administrative budget was very tight, a little bit underwater closing last year. So you'll see adjustments that are due to, catching up in terms of actual to budget mostly, and then basically ministerial catching up in the administrative budget. So in the staffing part, which is in your, in the budget bill, the personal service line of the appropriation section, that is the staffing and the DEVA held contracts are what are included in that section of the line item in your budget. And our total up there is $1.76 million, all funds. Of that, $964,000 and some change is GF. There is a need in our staffing budget to hire temps to help us finish the backlog we have for some of the redeterminations for mostly our what's called our MABD, our aged, blind, and disabled population. These are the more manual redeterminations. And so that's the first piece that's contributing to that ask for an up in our staffing budget. We have what is a up in our admin budget, but it is a gross neutral move because it's coming out of another part of our budget. We have a line of funding of $547,000 that goes to Vermont Legal Aid that had been carried for years in our program budget. Under new guidance, we need to move that into our admin budget. So it is an up in our admin budget, but you'll see it also as a down when we get into our program budget. And then we have several adjustments to DEVA held contracts that total $884,000. with 524 of that from our general fund. And I'm going to stop there and see if there are specific questions that you want to go through.
Students?
Just to be clear, Vermont Legal Aid funding is for the ombudsman's office and more, or is it just a general appropriation to them?
I believe this is for the healthcare advocate.
Yeah. But yeah.
And what are so that's a lot of money for contract funding adjustments. I wonder if you have a,
Yeah, this is where we would switch to the ups and downs.
all right. What are
So,
the contracts for, I guess, okay.
so there is one line item, the line item that's DEVA contracts net funding change for Medicaid advanced planning documents. And that is, when you go across that line item, if you're in the ups and downs, it's the second line down in our admin budget. You can see that that nets to zero, but it has an increase in our general fund. And that is internally us maximizing federal match dollars and putting functions that should be in a purely Medicaid APD into that position. And so while it's an up in our general fund, it's a down, you can see from the interdepartmental transfers. That means it's saving another, mostly the central office money. And then it's an up in federal funds, and that nets to zero. That's one piece of the contract changes.
Yeah.
The second piece is an amendment to our MMIS system main contract, our M&O contract. And that totals $331,000.
So I don't know what the, wait. That's for the,
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I read the wrong line. I read the wrong line. It's,
yes,
it's $684,000.
most of which is federal funds.
Most of which is federal funds.
Oh, Medicaid Management Information System.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the very last line, justice reentry, MMIS modifications, that's the third. And that line is in at a 50-50 match. And that is an initiative that is underway. And so this, that initiative requires modifications to our system. But it's not an implementation piece that has the higher match as the other one.
Great, thank you.
And then the other piece in our administration budget is in our operating section, our operating expenses. And as you can see, it looks like a very large down in our budget. That is almost entirely on it is entirely on the federal fund line. We several years ago had a one-time appropriation where the general fund is identified as one time, but the federal fund sort of got baked into our base. And so we took it down last year. We didn't take it down enough. We're taking it down again. So it's basically due to timing and sort of artifact of that we had over appropriated in our federal fund line. And just to remind the committee, just because we have a federal fund appropriation, it doesn't mean that we can actually spend those federal funds. We have to actually earn those federal funds. They have to be eligible and drawable federal funds. We need the spending authority in our federal fund line, but there will always be a difference between what is appropriated and what we actually, almost every budget will be like that. But so we're bringing that line down by $8 million just to correct the level of federal fund spending authority. So that's basically a technical adjustment. Then we have the same situation that I just described for these Medicaid only advanced planning document for, there are contracts that we pay for, but that are held by ADS. They're technical, contracts with our technical service providers. And so there's a chunk of those expenses that we want to make sure that we are maximizing the match on for the Medicaid only pieces of that work. And so you see that also nets to zero, but it's an up in our general fund, a down in the transferred money. And the savings that this generates for all state funds, even though it doesn't generate a GF savings for DEVA, is the value of the federal funds that you see there estimated.
So you're taking it out of interdepartmental. Who would have otherwise been paying for it?
The central office primarily was paying for it. And then we have what are called, I think you talked about this a little bit, as I saw from an email yesterday, the ADS service level agreement charges. That is catching up from what was budgeted to what is actually billed. And there's usually a timing gap. This is trying to close that timing gap across our part of the agency.
That's almost $1 million between general fund and federal fund.
Yeah. And then the last item on our operating expense is a 90/10 matchable assistance. We have a large procurement coming up, not in the immediate future, but this is giving us the technical assistance to start the process for our PBM reprocurement process. And so that money lets us get started this year. We will probably carry some of that money forward, just timing wise, but that's what you see on that last line in our operating budget.
And that's intended, I know we've talked a lot about pharmacy benefit managers over the last few years, and I know we're trying to reduce our costs for Vermonters because it's really expensive. So is this helping down that road, helping us down that road?
So this is the pharmacy benefit management function for DIVA for the pharmacy benefits that are members, Medicaid members, not the whole state.
Right, okay.
Medicaid members. So they manage that service as well as the rebates that are associated with Medicaid pharmacy expenditures. And that is a complicated and it needs a lot of, we have a pharmacy unit in DIVA that do great work and interact with the vendor that provides these services. And on the fiscal side, we are very keenly always watching the cost of the pharmacy claims expenditure and then the nature and the trajectory and trends on the rebates, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more in the 26 budget.
Okay, great, thank you.
So that's the picture of our administration budget.
Okay. Let's continue on then.
Okay, so now we're going to move into 3 new line items in the budget that are the program budget in DIVA. So all the money in these lines go out as grants to providers or to, in some cases, to pay the federal government for like our buy-in program, clawback payment. But the vast majority of the dollars of the $1.07 billion of program budget they go out to providers, mostly in-state providers, but some out-of-state providers. So that's the nature of these 3 programs, three line items, and they're in 3 line items for a reason. For basically the funding source of the service that we are paying for. And so our biggest line item is 307, which is, if you are looking at the ups and downs to the bottom right hand, $964 million, but it's all one funding source. And that is paying for basically all the claims for the global commitment eligible expenditures that flow through DIVA. And so do folks want to stop and talk about the global commitment, the nature of the global commitment? This is a blended state and federal dollar.
Right, we had Nolan talked about this. And so, yes, so this is the global commitment section.
Yeah.
So some of this is general fund and some of it is federal funds.
Right.
Correct. And is this?
To us, it's all $1.
Right.
And so if you're back on our narrative, the biggest driver of our increased ask for caseload and utilization is our biggest driver. for the increased ask for funding here. And we did end last year, June 2024, underwater in our program budget. A portion of that was due to timing to the rebates, and you will see that timing offset a couple lines down in our narrative. But a good sized chunk of it was due to claims coming in higher than we had forecast previously. And so I know you've probably talked about the consensus process, but the consensus process is DEVA, central office of the agency, joint fiscal, finance and management staff meeting to forecast what the fiscal need is for the Medicaid DEVA budget and we look at recent claims experience, we look at caseload, we're very good at forecasting caseload. Forecasting expenditures on the per member per month has been a more difficult process for the past 2 years because of the impact of the redeterminations. When we had the public health emergency, people weren't redetermined, so they stayed on. So they looked like they were on as a caseload, but they might not have been using Medicaid services. And so that has a distorting effect across our expenditures as we go through. And last year, when we were making our estimates, we weren't seeing until we got 6 months further on the bigger divergence between the expenditures for those that were remaining in Medicaid and those that were coming off through the unwind year. And that's the biggest driver that we're seeing here on the caseloading utilization. And Representative Iacoboni has a question.
Do you still use the 52 points of light?
So we've converted it to a monthly.
Is it a useful tool?
Well, it's very useful to me.
It used to be weekly, 52 points of light. Track the number.
And we switched to weekly as we head toward the end of the year for reasons to close the year, clearly. But we send out, and you will be getting, the folks that are on the list are getting it shortly, either Friday or next week, early next week. We provide the most recent spending against the budget. In this case, it'll be against the budget adjustment and what we're seeing. And and we do it by categories now that are very useful to me, understanding claims versus agreement-based payments versus pharmacy spend versus pharmacy rebates versus the other pieces of our budget. Everything in our budget are big chunks, but JFO is definitely on that list. We usually let JFO distribute it to the members that are interested in it.
So is the acuity of the claims, is it running hot in some programs more so than others? For instance, do you look at hospital claims?
So we, in doing this work of the forecast through the fall for our base budget, this $78 million piece, we go by the Medicaid eligibility group, and we did internally look at 4 of the major categories: the inpatient, the outpatient, the professional, and the pharmacy services. And for the stayers, the people that remained in Medicaid versus the ones that were leaving, you could see almost in every category a very big difference. That's driving it. But at the same time, you were seeing different trends on a cost basis. So some were, you could see it up through 23 and then flattening, but we have to go back and actually sort of finish because we were doing it with incomplete 24 data. And so we do look at that to try and understand. But for example, for inpatient, the majority of that expenditure flows through, except for the out-of-state piece for attributed lives through the ACO. So that's in our agreement-based payment as a prospective payment. So it becomes very complex to understand what the drivers might be. There are some areas which I think are fruitful to look at when we have some time in terms of understanding, because the kids aren't as, our general child population isn't as subject to the variation of the unwinding because they're at a higher income level. So that might be a fruitful area to understand. And we are seeing a higher cost per case there. not necessarily, driven by clearly identifiable that it's inpatient versus professional versus outpatient, but it might be very fruitful to understand what those look like.
If I may, Madam Chair, I just want a quick follow-up. You may or may not have the ability to look at this, but I was approached by some of our folks from our dental community who were saying folks were presumably for affordability issues, not doing preventative work, cleanings, et cetera. So when they did go into the dentist, it was more intense because things had deteriorated. Is that something you're able to look at and say, over time, we are noticing that the preventive claims, nature of the claims that are preventative are less than what they used to be? Do you have that ability?
We can ask and see if the
I'm
data.
not sure what it would drive from a policy standpoint, other to tell us that, there's reasons people don't go to the dentist, and I'm assuming some of it is cost. Dental benefit is not extremely robust
So it did.
beyond children.
No, well, we did an increase in payments 2 years ago, starting July 1, 23, a significant increase in payments to dentists.
Okay.
And we increased the adult dental cap. And you yesterday probably got a report on dental program, and that might be helpful to look
What is
at.
the cap now?
The cap is now $1,500 a year.
Thank you.
And so there is no cap though on children, but I'm sure from our population, cost is an issue, but it's also an access issue clearly across the state and with dental services.
Thank you.
Rep. Harrison and then Rep. Johnson.
So Stephanie, when I looked at the initial spreadsheet and the ups and downs overall, obviously the 35 million, regardless of what department it is a big number.
Yep.
And what I'm hearing you say is perhaps we projected, maybe a little short because through the redetermination, which at least one member referred to it as a very big deal, in a floor speech at one time that become famous, that your average, because you had a lot of members or clients in name only, essentially, because after the pandemic, they got out of their jobs that had health and care, so they were there, but your average claim overall were lower.
Our average cost.
Weren't drawing on it because they may not even know they still had Medicaid.
That is fair. And just for the folks that were on the committee last year, when I was in this chair last year, I was saying we actually said, take $50 million away from us. That was a mistake. After 9 months of experience.
I'm surprised the members carry the pledge. Catch that.
Well, we did not catch that, so we're not going to hold him to that.
Rep. Dickinson.
Yeah, I just want to speak up for the representative from Newport that you were very hard. Enough already. Anyway.
You're welcome anytime, Woody.
I do want to point out that my suspicion on the issue of the preventive dental claims is a workforce issue. We have a crisis in hiring and training of dental hygienists. And if every dentist in the state is looking for more hygienists and you don't have them there, you're going to treat fewer. That's an access problem. You see fewer preventive work. That may be part of it.
Thank you. Where in the narrative would it be appropriate for me to bring up the issue of some providers who are struggling and need financial assistance? Would that be under the global payment program, or would it be here under utilization? For both. I'd like to bring that up. So if it's not germane, tell me. We've had some, were you waving or did you have a question, Phil?
I was going to comment, that might be a budget issue, not a BAA issue. That might be a budget issue, not a BAA.
Well, if it's happening now, in the middle of this fiscal year, I'm not talking about 26, talking about now in 25. Thank you. So some providers, yesterday we had testimony about extraordinary financial relief in the long-term care sector. But there are other providers, maybe in primary care, who are experiencing a similar situation. Would you welcome language in the BAA that created a pathway, if you will, for extraordinary financial relief for home health, for FQHCs, for other different providers, so they too could have a place to go? Because like the long-term care policy, it was determined years ago, it's such a crucial service that you can't go without it in a community, and you need time to develop a bridge solution. I don't think you have that language. Would you welcome it?
Yeah, so I am aware of the provider financial hardships conversations that you have mentioned, and we continue to monitor what is going on and what is really driving those issues out in the community, and what kind of solutions there are. I think that's open to a longer discussion of what are the potential policies, what are the potential options what are needed. And I don't have an answer for that.
Well, we're trying to find out the solutions, though. Some may go under, and that creates a hardship for our communities. So it's almost like a lifeline, a lifeline to keep things afloat, maybe the wrong word, but to keep things somewhat stable until maybe those more challenging analyses as to the reason why it could be determined. Would that be helpful?
I'll just be the sort of hard dollar person here. We don't have funding right now within our budget for that. And we would work with whatever you would,
Well, isn't the BAA the place where someone would ask? If you saw that there were providers, more than one, but what looked to be possibly a systematic issue, isn't BAA a place or a department, if not yours, someone, to come in and say, we'd like an additional ask in this area for these reasons?
Yeah, the BAA would be the appropriate place to make that connection, yes.
Nobody seems to be making that request at this time, and yet some providers have come in to the department saying, gee, would you look at our scope of services? We'd like a review. I'm concerned, I'm not being critical, please, but I'm concerned that our solutions may not help Vermonters who depend on these services if we lose some providers. And how can we be more forthcoming, more preventative, more upstream, instead of letting them actually break, but to repair them, so to speak, until we found out, as you appropriately say, what's the root cause? I don't see that here. And if not here, where would it come from?
It is not here. There's not a line item or a consideration of that in the proposal that's in front of you from DIVA. I know that conversations have been going on, and so I assume that will come as a collaborative effort with the legislature and the administration, if that's the decision.
I'm thinking about some language to do that. My concern is, the BAA doesn't, just because we may vote on it later in January, it could be May before the decision's signed, and we'll lose people before then. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks. Let's continue.
So just on item one in the narrative, the caseload and utilization pressures, they do total $83 million, $83.47 million. That is $35.47 million of general fund. Of that 35, the $33 million of global commitment, that general fund is not in our budget. That is in the central office budget, just to recap. And so that's where we see the baseline for what we provide right now for the caseload that we have right now. As we move to item number 2, we have 2 areas pretty much annually where we have to keep up. We have to increase by what's called the medical economic index, the encounter payments that we make to our FQHCs. And so that has gone up by 3.5%, that starting in January. So the February payments will go up to the FQHCs. That's what a portion, the largest share of this is. And then we also have to maintain a floor of what we pay for hospice services. And that's a very modest amount that increases every year. And so on top of the caseload and utilization, we have these mandatory rate adjustments midstream included in our budget.
Mandatory? I'm sorry.
Well, sort of required to keep
They're
up.
fairly mandated.
Thank you.
Yeah. We have one piece of good news. It was not good news in June, but it's good news now. Item 3 is an offset. Because we had the Change Healthcare cybersecurity attack last spring, February through April, that delayed when rebates were invoiced to manufacturers and when they were collected. And those have come in now in July and August. And so we can apply them here. So that reduces the amount that we saw in number 1 for a need. It's just one time in nature. It contributed to our deficit when we closed the year, but it comes in, and that's what you see being offset here as a negative. So that's good news in terms of just the budget adjustment in a sense.
And hopefully we can just keep it out to be more real. I know this wasn't great, it wasn't your fault, but it did create a bit of havoc.
Yeah, and it was nail biting to understand how much was going to be collected, how big the bread box was going to be. The next item that we have is what is our ACO reconciliation. And this is for the 2023 program year, and it's a calendar year. And it usually takes a good 11, 12 months to reconcile the ACO. The ACO, as we know, is not going to be in business in 2026, but there will be reconciliation activity that follows the end of the ACO. The majority of this need is similar to the total need as we're presenting it here for reconciliation is about half of what it was last year. The portion that's due to the total cost of care is actually very, very, very close. It's within, like 99.9% of what was projected. In fact, it would have been a small amount of money due back from the ACO to the state. But the impact of the public health emergency and not redetermining folks, the way we make prospective payments based on attributed lives for regular adults, ABD adults, and children. And so when you sort of stop the clock in terms of the public health emergency and the redeterminations, we weren't picking up the change in the age as kids aged from being kid at a kid perspective rate versus being an adult perspective rate. And so that's the true up that you're seeing here for the majority of it. So for the 23 year, even though we started the redeterminations midway through 23, for the first half of 23, and through the rest of it as the unwind unfolded, we have still, and you saw this last year in our ask as well, this impact in reconciliation where we weren't making the payments based on the actual age of the individual being in the right category. And so that a little bit of that normally happens, but it doesn't build up like it built up from 20 to 21 to 22, where you had a large number of attributed lives that didn't move to the right category. And so we should not be seeing this again for the 2024 reconciliation or the 2025 reconciliation. It should just be the normal amount of transition. But that's what's driving this $5.1 million, is that true up in that agreement setting.
A question on this time. This is from fiscal year 23.
No, it's program calendar year 23.
Calendar year 2023. So are we going to have two more of these? Because there's two.
So you're going to have two more reconciliations. You should not have the degree of what's happening to the true up of the age of folks moving from the child category to the adult category.
So what happens in 2 years from now? The ACO will have been gone for a year. Where does the money go?
So the activity, I can't answer that question. I believe there's planning for
Coming up.
what needs to happen for the continuation after that.
Right, the ahead or whatever.
Yeah, I'm sure that the ACO could answer what their intention is in terms of the shutdown of.
Because if it's gone, who do you give, who do you give?
I'm sure those considerations are.
I just didn't know if you knew that already.
No.
So Rep. Stevens?
So consider me just a newbie with this language and the way that you do budgeting or the way that we should be considering this. A BAA request. So I just want to ask a question about the global commitment. Global commitment funds are for services that are being provided. There's more services needed. Therefore, there's more funding needed to this level, the 35 million is our state request.
Yeah, what you saw in the chart for item number 1 under the program budget.
So that's a reaction to what was budgeted. I noticed that you make your first estimate or request in calendar year 23 for fiscal year 25. So we know that there's a lot that's happened that happens in the rest of the world. I get that with all the cost sharing reductions, manipulations, and I mean that in a positive way. Does this then go into your thinking when you're budgeting in the big bill of lifting the base amount because this particular year you had more use of that global commitment, or do you go back to a base number and say, well, traditionally, or however you want to put it, we get this number of cases. It just so happened that this year was high use.
So we do, the consensus process looks at the 2 years, the year we're in, and then the next year for the 26 budget. And so our consensus process does look at the baseline, which is the 25 as passed, and then looks to see what is now halfway through 25 does it need to be, and then what in 26 does it need to be. So you will see, at the same time, we are looking at the caseload trends. And so you will see a similar analysis presented to you in 26 based on that process.
And do you include potential population changes where, for instance, the inflation may push some people over X% of the federal poverty level? Do those get added in as part of the algorithm, or?
So we do not, we base it on what we're seeing in the trend in caseload. And so that's usually a pretty steady month to month by each Medicaid eligibility category. We are not projecting a recession and saying the caseload's going to go up because of that or something like that. We are saying, the general adult population is looking like this, and it's, its trend is this way. The new adult population, which is where most of the people came off, is trending slightly down. But we are not making sort of bets on the economic picture in 26 beyond what the current baseline is telling us. That, it could change. We would be in a catch-up situation, but we are assuming pretty much status quo in terms of the current caseload trend line that we see. Years ago in the Great Recession, Medicaid was one of the leading indicators where, same people were assuming a baseline as the economy deteriorated. Medicaid is one of the places where you saw, enrollment increase quickly, but that's not part of our forecast. Obviously, if we were heading into something like that, we don't, we would start to pay attention to what do we think it means, and it would fold into this regular budgetary cycle.
This increase is simply, not simply, there's nothing simple about it, but just the idea here is what's actually happening as opposed to what might have been expected or projected.
Yes, we're making projections based on the trends we see right now, taking the baseline that we have, which is what we passed a year ago, for the 25 budget and saying, this is the way we see the caseload going. This is the way we see the cost per case going. This is what we're asking for based on that. If the greater economic scenario starts to change that, we would be paying attention to that and saying, oh, we think that, and that's where Representative Iacoboni asked about what's called, was formerly called the 52 points of light. We now call it the monthly program dashboard. We will be monitoring it through that process.
Thank you.
Please continue.
So no more questions on the ACO reconciliation?
Good there.
Okay. We have a couple of neutral program adjustments. One of them we've already talked about. That is the legal aid moving up from the program budget into the admin budget. So it's a down here, but it's an up there, so it's neutral in terms of gross dollars. There is a small difference in the match rate between the two, so it does have a little bit of a general fund impact, but in terms of the amount going to legal aid, it is a net neutral amount in total. And then we have two programs that were in our program budget, but need to be in our global commitment investment budget. That is our Blueprint Spoke program and what is called the Pregnancy Intention Initiative, which used to be the Women's Health Initiative, which pays for care for prenatal. It has enhanced payments for that activity, but it's no change in the estimate of the cost of the program. We just have to move those two programs out of what is base Medicaid and into our investment. So it doesn't change the dollar amount or the match amount at all. It just has to be accounted for in the waiver in the right bucket. And we had it in our program budget, and our review shows that it needs to be in our investment bucket.
Great, thank you.
And then our last adjustment is in the Vermont cost sharing reduction program. And that is a fully general funded program that we've had since Obamacare turned on. But there was a significant change in the way the silver plans were priced at the Green Mountain Care Board. And so we have less people in the silver plans enrolled now for 2025 than deliberately in a sense. And so we don't have as large a cost on this program. It means people are going into other metal categories for the folks that are not, they're buying their insurance on the exchange. They're getting premium assistance help still, but the cost sharing reduction piece that was tied to the silver plans has changed, and you'll see this annualized in our 26 budget as well. But this is a pure state GF reduction, and it's a half year cost because we're a fiscal year and the plan year is a calendar year.
So Rep. Harrison and then Rep. Beckman.
Stephanie, I think maybe in the fall, I saw one of the notices from our healthcare advocate. And it sounded like, if I recall, that like the gold plan for people who are getting help was actually less expensive than the silver.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll defer to Nolan on. Yeah.
Maybe we can ask later. it was curious to me as to why that was. And maybe it's relation to this cost sharing reduction, but.
And I think it's decisions about how to, with the advanced premium tax credits, how to maximize. And you will also have a report on the marketplace that should have dropped into your realm. That might be helpful if you have more questions in that regard.
I can talk to you offline.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Noel. Rep. Iacoboni?
Just covered.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Onward.
And the last item in our budget is, we had a one-time request that you funded last year for a global payment program pilot that was so the ACO covered attributed lives for services. This was to actually have hospitals that wanted to opt in to have a global payment for the non-attributed lives, so the same set of services that would be under the ACO. And so we had 5 hospitals, UVM network, so Central Vermont, UVM, Porter, Rutland, and Northeast opt-in. And we are asking for an increase in that appropriation. It is not, this appropriation is for what's called the tail of claims. So when you're switching from a fee-for-service to a prospective payment, you have a gap where you're making the prospective payment sooner and you still have claims coming in. And that's what this is covering. And so allowing additional hospitals to join and also to true up that tail cost, because we had the largest hospitals join. And so we know what the tail is for the 5 that we have that started in August. And, it takes about 8 to 12 weeks to fully understand what the tail is. And so that's what you see here is an increase of $4 million. You gave us 9.3. And this would allow additional hospitals to opt into this pilot program.
So this should be the only time that we have this particular.
Yeah, it's not an ongoing base cost pressure. It's a fiscal gap that if we do this program, it's a fiscal gap to us.
Right, and this closes the gap.
This closes the gap.
Yeah, new tails. Okay. It's not for this. Great. Rep Yakubov.
May I ask, what has the pilot shown thus far? What were you hoping to accomplish and has it?
So the pilot was to allow us to make a sort of a more full global payment between the hospitals that opted in under their regular ACO payment. And so those
Moving them away from fee-for-service?
moving the unattributable
People who were not covered by
people away from the fee for service. And so that it is, we're only 6 months into it, or even 5 months into it. But this program is fully reconciled to claims. There won't be a sort of an over under.
Okay. Do you have anything else, or is that your presentation? We're good?
That's the money in DEVA.
Committee, is anybody or Rep Page, anybody have any last questions for this? And you've probably all figured out that Rep Yakuboni has this budget. So we thank you very much for coming in and explaining it all. And I'm sure we'll see you again when we get the FY26 budget.
From Newport.
I looked over and I didn't see anybody inside. So thank you, committee. Before we break, which is in just a couple of minutes, I'm sending out, I hope during the break, a letter to the chairs and vice chairs about the budget adjustment, and that they need to get back to us by a week from today on their issues. But what I'd really like is to have you all connect with your committees of jurisdiction, and you kind of know now what they've got in a budget adjustment, and let them know as well. So they're going to be looking on their end, but you can also help them by saying, there's something here, the Department of Labor, there's whatever. So, and be sure in the language that you're looking at the reversions and all the other pieces, not just you have B200. There could be language and reversion. So help them see all those things as well. So it would be great if between today and tomorrow, you can connect with everybody. So that's what I've got for now. And why don't we go off live? We'll meet back here we start with Department of Mental Health at 11 a.m.